you for joining us this morning. I'm Jim O'Halloran, President and CEO of the Missouri Society of CPAs. One of our most trusted partners and advisors over the years has been economist Chris Kuehl, who we're all here to see today. Though he's seen as a global expert and travels the world sharing his insight, we're certainly fortunate that he hails from Kansas City and has always made it a priority to collaborate with us and our members. When this pandemic hit, we immediately reached out to each other to see how we can best inform our members. And from this conversation, then, the webcast series was developed. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn the reins over to Chris Kuehl. Chris?
All right, thank you very much, and happy Friday. I don't know if anything is really happy these days, but we will get through this in some form or another, and what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes is a bit about what we know about the virus itself, but I promise I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm an economist, and I'm going to get on to the economic stuff as quickly as I can and leave the doctor stuff to somebody who's got a little more background. So what we're dealing with at the moment is really almost a classic Black Swan event. Those of you who are not familiar with this concept, this is something that has been in philosophical circles for years, but was sort of adopted by economists about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe longer. What it refers to is an unexpected, expected event. It's something that you know is going to happen. You know that it is a threat, but you don't know exactly when. You don't know exactly how. You don't know how exactly it's going to manifest. We know that we have been subject to viral epidemics for the better part of the last 2 decades. We have dealt with SARS. We've dealt with MERS. We've had avian flu, swine flu, Ebola, Marburg, Zika. The list goes on and on. So it was not surprising that we ended up with yet another viral outbreak. We have dealt with varying degrees of extreme flu from year to year. So question was, what would this one look like and how would it manifest? How is it different from things that we've dealt with before? What will we have to do to prepare for the next unexpected, expected event? So as we go through all this, we'll be a little bit focusing on what's happened in the past, a little bit about what's happening right now, and then probably a lot more attention to what's going to happen down the road. So what do we know right now? A lot is still unknown. We get more information pretty much every day. We know the market collapsed, but has been volatile ever since then. It has come back for a few days, and then it drops again. Then it comes back up, and it drops. The market is uncertain. It does not really understand what is happening. It doesn't know if it's going to get worse or better, and you sort of see a pattern of grasping at straws, and this is going to go on, I think, for the next couple of months. We know that the supply chains were shattered. That originally was the problem. I mean, the U.S. really didn't have a COVID-19 issue in January, but we were suffering from the fact that China did, and it was affecting the supply chain. Those supply chains from Asia now are starting to make a comeback, and that's a little bit of the good news in all of this, is that there seems to have been a corner turned in some parts of the world, and we'll talk about more of those details in a moment. The biggest issue right now is the government-mandated shutdowns. They've continued to expand social distancing. The challenge with social distancing is that it works best when it is launched really, really early. Those countries that were slow to get into it, which includes the U.S. and Europe, have not seen the response that countries that started it early did. The exemplar so far for rapid response has been South Korea. And if you look at how the disease has progressed there, it has definitely reached peak and is now in decline, and South Korea is really discussing recovery sooner than later. But they got into the social distancing right away. They also did a lot of testing right away, and they concentrated their testing on the first responders, on people who are the most likely to be victimized. Those of you who are familiar with South Korea, though, know that this is a country that is constantly on what amounts to a war footing. They are constantly prepared for the next North Korean invasion, and that makes the population very responsive to things that the government tells them to do. Just as an example, a colleague of mine was in South Korea a few years back and was checking into his hotel, and the sirens went off for one of their drills. And literally, in the time that it took for him to turn to his friend, turn back to the hotel clerk, he had changed out of his suit into fatigues and was holding an automatic weapon. And looked at the guy and said, "Really?" And he says, "Yeah, I wear my fatigues under my suit, and the automatic weapon is under the desk." It says, we're 20 miles from the North Korean border here. If there's an invasion, we don't have time. We have to be ready. So when the government said shut down, when the government said stay home, when the government said get tested, the Koreans stayed home, hunkered down, got tested. They were quite a bit more obedient than some other cultures have been. We know that the central banks have done about all they can. They are still trying to promote liquidity. They've lowered rates. They've done bond buying. The challenge right now is that that tool is not as effective as it would be because so much has been shut down. The whole idea of liquidity is to get money in the hands of consumers so that they spend their way out of a recession. Well, with everything closed, there's not much spending. There's only so much hand sanitizer we can buy. Apparently, we are trying to preserve the U.S. economy by buying toilet paper. So that is at some point going to, I hope, begin to fade. But that's going to be the great mystery of all time for me. What are people doing with that much toilet paper? Anyway, Congress has acted at last. There's been a $2 trillion package. We'll talk a little bit about those implementation issues as we go on. And then, as I said, there are some nations that have seen a peak. We think we'll see how that plays out in the weeks to come. So a few things just to put this in perspective. This isn't the flu, but it's also not the plague. It is kind of somewhere in between. When it comes to the number of people who infected by an individual, it is more virulent than the flu. It lasts longer than the flu. It is, however, not spreadable generally by aerosol means, so it's not like when people sneeze and cough, and if you're not standing relatively close to that person, you are not subject to the disease. However, if you are touching something that has been infected, the virus stays intact longer than the flu virus does. The incubation time is probably the critical thing, and this is what has made it more dangerous than the flu. You know you have the flu within a couple of days. There's no mystery. We all know the symptoms. We all know the drill. We know we're sick. You can have the coronavirus for almost 2 weeks where you really know that you have it. And as a result, people they're not seeking help. They're not isolating. They're not, why would they? They don't think they have anything. And one of the challenges now is that a lot of people are beginning to deal with seasonal allergies. And they're like, okay, I'm sneezing and I'm coughing and my throat hurts and I'm having trouble breathing. Yeah, but I have this every spring. I'm allergic to pollen. I'm allergic to all kinds of stuff coming into the air. So it makes it even more confusing to determine if you've got the disease. The hospitalization rate is higher, and this is one of the reasons that it has become such a health concern. Only about 2% of people who get the flu need hospitalization. The trouble with COVID-19 is that it provokes pneumonia, and it attacks the lungs, and even people who are not compromised in one way or the other end up having fairly severe breathing issues, and hospitalization is required. The fatality rate for the flu is generally 0.1% or under. It depends on the strain. We've had some in the past that have been 1.4, 1.5, which is similar to what you see with COVID-19. Originally, we thought it had a higher fatality rate because the early tests were really just of the vulnerable population. We didn't realize that there was an awful lot of other people who had it and were not experiencing the severe version. If you look at the other viruses that we have dealt with, This one is not nearly as deadly as SARS or bird flu or Ebola or MERS or smallpox. It isn't even as deadly as the Spanish flu, but it is deadlier than most of the seasonal flus, deadlier, of course, than the common cold, even though the coronavirus is essentially a cold virus. I mean, it's not radically different from things that we've experienced before, but it's a new variation. The challenge is that it spreads faster. It spreads about as fast as polio did. It spreads as fast as smallpox, essentially. Doesn't spread as fast as measles. Measles is still the champion when it comes to rapidity of spread. One of the early determinants of whether a country was going to get control of this was testing. And as you can see, we weren't ready. And we were very slow to test. Right now, we're looking at probably around 40 out of a million being tested. South Korea is 3,700. They were much more aggressive in testing. China was more aggressive. I mean, even Italy was more aggressive in testing than we have been. Part of it was a shortage of test kits. Part of it was bureaucracy. There were a lot of test kits that were being made available, but they weren't approved yet. We weren't allowing private testing centers to do testing, and we weren't prepared. We didn't have a system in place, and that delayed things by at least a week, possibly longer than that. If you look at how countries have reacted, most have been very similar. You have seen rate cuts in a few countries where their central banks have played a role. That's been the case in the U.S. Most of the rest of the world concentrated on spending increases, and now, of course, we have too. So virtually everybody has taken the same fiscal approach: spend money, get money into the hands of people. A few countries have done tax cuts. We have not been one of them, but it's still relatively rare. A few countries have tried to actually do market support. We're not one of those either, but you've seen that in China and Japan. And then a few countries have done more with the banks, but that's relatively rare as well. You've seen some of it in Thailand, some of it in the Middle East, but not really in much of the rest of the world. Here's the good news slide. You know, if there's such a thing, we're seeing a peak being reached in countries. We have definitely reached a peak in China. We reached one in South Korea. We probably have reached it in Japan and Singapore. Most of the rest of the world is still seeing growth. The epicenter for the time being has shifted to the United States, but this has all sort of been timing. Started in China, so it was worse in China. Then it spread to Asia, then it spread to Europe, then it spread to the United States. Within the next week to two, we will see a decline, most likely in our cases, but it will become a lot more virulent in Latin America, in Africa, in places that it's just now starting to hit. And they're probably going to see a bigger problem than anybody has thus far, because they're even less prepared for this in the countries that have been hit so far. So the good news is that it seems to have a lifespan, and it seems to have a fairly common lifespan. Most COVID cases now are outside China, which is kind of good and bad news. It's bad news that we're seeing the cases grow outside China, but the good news is China hit a peak in mid-February and stayed there. And since mid-March, it has begun to see a decline, particularly in the places where it started. Life is more or less back normal in Hubei province and Wuhan. The factories are open again, the businesses are open, traveling has been done, people are outside, the number of cases is down. There have been lots of concerns as to whether we can trust Chinese data, and in the early stages, we probably couldn't. We know that Wuhan was lying to Beijing. They did not want to admit to their own leaders that they had gotten out of control in Hubei province. China itself, I think, was trying to hide the reality for a while, but today, China is just literally crawling with health officials from everywhere in the world. WHO is there, CDC is there, the Japanese Ministry of Health is there, the European health authorities are there. Everybody you can think of is in China watching this pandemic. So the data coming out of China now is predominantly international data. The Chinese, of course, are still collecting information too, but any temptation that they would have to fudge has been reduced because they've got WHO and CDC and everybody else leaning over their shoulder going, that's not true. We see these numbers. We're going to report it even if you don't. This is another encouraging slide. If you have been watching the economic news, and we're finally getting to the economics part, the Purchasing Managers Index for the world was awful this month. I mean, the European Combined Index dropped into the 30s, which is just ridiculously low. The U.S. down by 10 points. The Purchasing Managers Index is a good month-to-month indicator of where the economy is, because purchasing managers are, generally speaking, unbiased. You know, they don't really know enough to lie when it comes right down to it. I mean, they're being asked, are you buying more or less of something? And they report that they're buying more or less of something. And as a result, you get very good data. The good news on this slide is that you had a very dramatic kind of bounce back as far as the PMI. They were down in the low 40s, 30s, and all the way back up to 52. So when the opportunity came, they recovered. You had that short, sharp recession, the V, which is the ideal. If you're going to have a recession, you want one that is quick and recovers fast, and thus far, seeing some of that indication out of China. If you look at, okay, my slides are not moving. We'll try this. If you look at the differences in coronavirus deaths, just again a reiteration of how the trending has been going. China, South Korea, even Germany has seen a bit of a decline. Countries that were slower to respond or have been less prepared, and frankly have not had as much cultural cooperation. When the Italians were told, you know, social isolation, don't go out, they completely ignored it and just went about their business like they did. We're Italians, we don't care. The Germans are like, okay, are we supposed to line up? And it's like, yes, you're Germans, behave. And for the most part, they did. So consumers are now finally worried. For a while, they weren't. We were kind of at mixed feelings about whether or not this was an issue. Now, easily 70% of the population is concerned about what it will mean to their community, and so you've got some consensus. The group that most confuses me every time I see this chart is the one in the middle, that's neither concerned nor unconcerned. How do you not have an opinion at this point? These are the people who are still to figure out what Kim Kardashian is going to do. I mean, it just drives me insane. You've either got to have a positive or negative. How do you remain neutral in a circumstance like this? But there they are. We have seen the markets bounce all over the place. Obviously hit a low, have come back a little bit from that low, come back down. But whether it's been the markets themselves, the oil market, whatever, they just respond to rumors. You watched in the last couple of days the oil market recover. Down to around 20 bucks a barrel, then came up by almost 10 or 15, simply based on a statement from Trump that says, I've been talking to the Russians and the Saudi Arabians, both of which responded by saying, no, we're not. The Russians said, we're not talking to anyone about anything. We're not talking to Trump. We're not talking to the Europeans. We're going to keep our prices right where they are. The Saudis basically had the same thing. But the markets got excited just because there was a statement that might possibly be true. Well, it probably isn't true. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on with oil, but Russia and Saudi Arabia are seizing the opportunity to bury the U.S. oil production business. This is a very obvious war. If we had any doubts as to whether or not these two countries are more enemy than friend, this really ought to end that conversation. They are not our friends. They never have been, and they are certainly not acting like friends right now. Three different scenarios as far as where this is concerned. Right now, the vast majority still think we're looking at a May reboot. If we get that, that means that we're going to be back to semi-normal behavior by the summer. We will probably be back into at least respectable growth by June or July. If it lasts through the summer and it's going to be June even into July, then you have a slower recovery, you get a deeper recession, and it takes a while to come back. And then the worst case scenario is that we don't really get a recovery until fall. But even with these really bad news, I mean, the best of all options is we get a 1.6% drop and then a recovery. The worst option is a 6% drop and then a recovery. Gets us back to probably mild recession, worst case scenario, but at this point you still have more people pointing towards me than later. So now we have the government bailout to deal with. Still evolving. It was a 900-page long piece of legislation. Some of it was purely political. The $1,200 checks are not going to have much of an impact on the economy. This is 2 weeks' wage for a minimum wage worker. $15 an hour worker working a 40-hour week is going to make $1,200. If they've lost their job, this isn't going to help them that much. And we can tell from polls that most people are not planning to spend it as much as they plan to save it. They're going to try to back themselves up for just another little while until they figure out what's happening with employment. The key thing in this provision is employment. There will probably be more of an impact if they expand unemployment benefits and make them last a little longer. But the real key will be those two loan programs. There's one aimed at small business and there's one aimed at larger business. The small business and large business loan programs both have similar provisions. They are both designed to protect jobs. This is the paycheck protection part of this. But if you're going to also get a loan from the government, you have to promise not to lay people off. How they're going to enforce that is not altogether clear, but that's built into the program, is that you are not supposed to lay people off. The larger businesses will not be allowed to do stock buybacks. Members of the administration will not be eligible for any of the bailouts. So it doesn't go to Trump's family or anybody in the executive office or congressional members. That's fairly standard. Whenever there's a bailout like this, the people who are doing the bailing don't normally get a chance to benefit from the money. But enforcement is a trick, and there are always ways somehow to get around some of those restrictions. There is likely to be a government stake in terms of investment. The airlines in particular will be giving up equity to the government, similar to what happened during the GM bailout a few years ago. GM got a lot of money from the government got equity in return, with the idea that when GM recovered, that equity would be more. The government could then sell their stake in GM and make back some of the money they invested, which is exactly what they did. And the payoff was pretty healthy. GM's recovery was substantial, and the government got a lot of money back. The notion is that the airlines will do the same, that when they come back to life, they will be in much better shape, their stock prices will go up, and the government can sell that equity and make the money back. So the key to all of this is going to be keeping people employed as long as possible. The sectors that are at highest risk, no big surprise, travel, leisure, anything that's connected to crowds. So restaurants and sporting events and entertainment venues and parks and all those sorts of things all being affected. Manufacturing so far has not had a huge hit. Depends on what manufacturing it's connected to. For example, those who are in the oil sector are feeling it, but not really because of COVID-19. They're getting hit by the oil war with the Saudis and the Russians and a reduction in demand for oil. But it's more the decisions of our rivals than it is COVID-19 that's affected oil. You have actually seen an increase in production of things like heavy trucks. The transportation sector is booming right now because everybody is getting their stuff shipped in. There's a whole lot less activity in the actual stores. The hair sector is doing quite well for obvious reasons. If you're in the position of producing the machines and the devices that are in desperate need right now, well, there's money to be made there. Farm has done relatively okay, but when you start looking at sectors like automotive, it's been doing well until very recently, and now all of a sudden it's beginning to fall off a little bit. So I think some of the manufacturing impact has been delayed, but thus far a lot of those sectors have escaped the worst of it. Leading indicators, some do well, some not. Coal consumption is down. You are seeing less industrial activity. Freight logistics is up. So the transportation sector has basically been responding very positively to this, all except ocean cargo, for all kinds of obvious reasons. The ocean cargo sector is not doing all that well. The hardest hit job markets, again, no big surprise. If you are dependent on tourism and entertainment, it's going to be hitting you very hard. Some of the worst hit areas, Vegas, Florida, and for the rest of the country, it's essentially population centers. The more population you have, the more chance that you're going to have high unemployment. One of the takeaways from this chart is that we all need to move to Alaska or possibly western Nebraska or western Kansas. It's perfectly safe out there. I don't know what one does in Colby and Goodland, but if one does get a chance to drive through the great state of Kansas, you will get to visit, I'm sure, Liberal, which is one of my favorite towns, if only because of bumper stickers you see all over Liberal. Liberal bumper stickers say simply, liberal isn't. This is a conservative part of the country, and they don't want people to get the wrong idea. So it's obvious now where one should live if you want to be safe from the coronavirus. The Credit Managers Index, we talked a little bit about the Purchasing Managers Index. I do the Credit Managers Index for the National Association for Credit Management, and as you can tell, it didn't look too healthy this month. But what's interesting about it is why it fell and what it sort of tells us about the future. We divide this index into two categories. There are the favorables and the unfavorables. Favorables are things like sales, applications for credit, dollar collections, amount of credit extended, so things that make a credit manager happy. The unfavorables are disputes, bankruptcies, slow pays, accounts out for collection, customer deductions, things that make credit managers unhappy. All of the damage has been in the favorables. Sales collapsed in 30s. Almost everything else is in the 40s. And these were numbers that had been in the upper 50s and even 60s. So when it came to the current activity, there was a dramatic decline. Everything on the unfavorable side held steady except for slow pays. Slow pays began to show up pretty dramatically. Companies are hoarding cash. So what we've seen so far is a reaction to the immediate crisis, but the longer term still hasn't quite manifested, and it might not for a month or two, because when you think about it, things like disputes and bankruptcies and accounts out for collection, those won't appear right away. I mean, if you're in trouble, you don't owe your credit person for another couple of months. I mean, you got 90-day terms, you got 120-day terms, you got 180-day terms. Your creditor isn't going to come after you until you're due to pay. So if there's a recovery before 90, 120, 180 days, you may not fall into the collection category at all. Disputes will be slow to develop. Bankruptcies won't be overnight. They will take place in the months to come. So what we're seeing now is an immediate response in the favorables, but a delayed response in the unfavorables, which would suggest that there's still time to kind of pull out of this if we get some reversals. So ending off here with kind of the scenarios, we have the V, the U, or the L. We either have a V recession, which ends in a hurry, starts in a hurry. We have the U, which is nearly the same as the V, but you linger at the bottom for a while before you recover. And then the L, which is the worst. That's what we got in 2008. We got a long, drawn-out recovery. It was referred to as an L or as a checkmark recovery. We were still feeling recessionary in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. It just took a long time to recover. This recession is very likely to be a short one, simply because it's a mandated recession. This is not something that requires a recovery in the economy as much as it requires the government to lift the restrictions. And if that happens and the consumer responds, then you get a comeback pretty quickly. If you look at, for example, how we get to these specific good, bad, ugly outcomes, if we're going to get the good outcome, if we're going to get the V, these things have to happen. The virus set has to fade within the next 5 to 8 weeks. Warmer weather may play a role. Enforced isolation, no a likely outcome. Consumers will have to react strongly. And this is really the key to all of this. The consumer is going to have to get back to consuming as soon as some kind of an all clear is sounded. There's a lot of skepticism about this, but I have great confidence in the American consumer. We cannot stand to have money in our pockets. It just drives us nuts. We are the country, after all, that made the guy that invented the pet rock a millionaire. We will buy anything. And I think as soon as we're allowed to go back to buying, we will, and with some enthusiasm. I mean, I'm confident. If the Chinese can go back to work, so can we. The government would have to leave the liquidity measures in place for a while. Low rates would stay, tax breaks would stay, the increased spending would stay. There's a lot of pressure to go back and try to deal with the deficit. You know, we've got a massive debt, we have a massive deficit. There are people who are not happy with what's been happening recently, but this is a problem that really should have been solved 10 years ago. Now is not the time to worry about the debt, but shortly after we get back on our feet, we are going to have to. The economists have been warning about this for 10, 15 years, saying, you know, if you have a big emergency like this one, you're not ready, which we're not. We're going to need to have the virus fade in key markets. It's going to have to improve in places like Europe, China, Japan, elsewhere. And we're going to have the infrastructure keep pace. This has been a strain as far as our infrastructure is concerned, and all of you have experienced it. We're now working from home, and so we're competing with all the kids who are staying on their video games all day playing Fortnite, and we can't get a word in edgewise. Our infrastructure is creaking at the moment. So what happens if we get a bad outcome? It's not catastrophic, but the virus doesn't fade as quickly as we thought it would. Containment is spotty. Consumers remain cautious after the all clear and don't go back to normal as quick as we'd like. The government measures end too quickly. The Fed begins to put rates back up too soon, and the markets begin to struggle. The virus continues to spread in important places, Europe and elsewhere in the world, and our infrastructure begins to really break down. There's a lot of indication that it's happening at the healthcare level, not nationwide. It's sort of been concentrated in places that have been hit the hardest. This is the outcome that gives you the U, where you're sort of lingering at the bottom, but eventually come back out of it. And then there's the ugly outcome, which I want to hasten to add is not likely, but this is the virus can't be managed. There's no vaccine or cure. Panic takes control. Operations fall into bankruptcy. The government can't help anymore. The entire world shuts down, and there's a zombie apocalypse, and it's all over. That is very unlikely. It's given less than a 10% chance of taking place. And really, if we were going to be in this kind of scenario, we've been there already. We would have seen the problems in China accelerate instead of getting better. How likely is a recovery in the not terribly distant future? Probably still pretty likely. We're still looking at decent numbers for 2021. I think 2020 will be a little lower than these were assumed to be. This was the prediction that you saw at the beginning of the year. But most are still holding out hope for a decent 2021. If you look at how economists are even looking at this year, assuming that we are through to a degree with this by May, early June, we are probably looking at still a 1.7, 1.5% growth rate. which isn't great, but it's about what we were in 2016. It's about what we were in 2013. We've been worse. So again, it just kind of comes down to timing, and it's very difficult at this stage to predict. What we're dealing with in the world as a whole is almost an oversupply of information. An interesting research topic was devised not long ago, just looking at the number of authorities talking about this. There are 537 different agencies reporting on what's happening with COVID-19 right now. 164 of them in the United States alone. So there's 164 people or groups trying to tell us what's happening with COVID-19, and that creates a lot of confusion. You have people who are dismissing it as not a big issue. You have people that are saying it's the worst thing that's ever happened to the world, and the truth is probably in between somewhere. We also have an awful lot of instant experts. I keep seeing these long dissertations by somebody who identifies himself as a doctor, and you get to the end of it, and it's like there was one that just went into great detail about how all of this was not being properly reported, blah, blah, blah. And the guy is a dermatologist. I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't really want to trust Dr. Pimple Popper to tell me what to do with the COVID-19 virus. I mean, I'd rather listen to an epidemiologist. It's kind of like going to get brain surgery from a guy that does plastic surgery. Anyway, that's just a personal note. So, shifting value. We now know what is valuable in the world is hand sanitizer and toilet paper. This will become the new currency. The dollar will no longer be a particularly useful thing because we now will know what's important. And those of you who want more, you know who you are. You are already getting the business intelligence brief from MOCPA, and if you're not, you can certainly ask and they'll put you on the list. If you want to call me, feel free. We also do a publication called the Black Report, which comes out 3 times a week as well. So at this point, I'm going to shut up, and Dan is going to find questions for me, and you can send them by chat, I think. Is that how it works?
That is correct. Thanks again, Chris, for all this great information. I know there's a lot to take in here. With about 200 registrations here, we do have 2 questions. The first one is, how can we spend money in the local economy to help?
Probably the local economy issue is kind of tricky because, if the stores were open, it would be a lot easier than dealing with them closed. The things that have been recommended, one has been to try to do as much as we can with the local small operation. If we have an option between a large player and a small player, orient towards the small player. Number 2, try to continue to do as much normal activity as possible, even if it means having stuff delivered or going to restaurants for takeout as opposed to actually going to restaurants. Most importantly, it's being prepared to go back to normal as quickly as possible. There's going to be a natural tendency when this is over for people to be skeptical that it's over. And we're not automatically going to start running around shaking everybody's hands and hugging them. We're still going to be worried. So we sort of need to accept the fact that there will still be a risk, but the risk will be, even as we're looking at it now, not again to dismiss this by any stretch of the imagination, but we have as a society learned to accept trade-offs in all kinds of areas. We lose 40,000 people a year to automobile accidents, which we could stop if we wanted to. We could make sure the cars don't go more than 5 miles an hour. We could do all kinds. We don't, because we've decided that we can accept a certain number of people being hurt and killed. Not that we want to accept what happens with this virus, but there'll be a point at which we're going to have to turn to people and say, if you feel at risk, be more careful than the person who isn't. Get tested. A lot of the real change in this will take place when there's 3 things. 1, testing at a much, much greater level than we have now. Number 2, the existence of treatments that works. There is evidence that those are now beginning to show up, not widely disseminated yet. And then finally, the thing that will end it for sure is the development of vaccine, which at this point is at a minimum 6 months away, though maybe faster. The Germans seem to think that they'll have one within 3 to 4 months, but that's the closest we have at this point to getting out of it.
Right. Do you see another stimulus act being implemented or even necessary?
There is talk about another stimulus, which is going to be oriented towards infrastructure. This is not the first time we've talked about infrastructure. We bring that up about every other minute, never seem to have the money for it. The misnomer, I think, about the infrastructure as stimulus is that there are still people that don't understand how infrastructure is done these days, and they still think it's a big mass employment thing. It really isn't. It's now a much more technical kind of world, and companies that are building roads and bridges and engaging in infrastructure, they're not going to hire people that used to work at Olive Garden. I mean, they're facing difficulties finding skilled people already. But what infrastructure would add would be more money going into companies that could keep more employees. So far, there's not been much discussion about a repeat of the kind of infrastructure plan that has already been proposed. But that could change. I mean, if we're still dealing with this by the end of April, there might be another discussion, except that right now, our debt levels are so high that it's very discouraging to think of adding more.
Right. Do you think the mood will darken in the U.S. over the next couple of weeks, or do you see things holding steady since we've been so prepared that cases and deaths will rise and peak soon?
Yeah, I think you'll probably have a similar kind of pattern as you've had in other parts of the world. We're probably just now hitting the worst stage in terms of outbreaks. We are probably going to be close to a peak in the next 2 to 3 weeks. If we follow the same pattern that's been followed in other countries, peak will then be followed by a decline, and people will start to feel encouraged. That's what's happened in China. It's happened in Singapore, South Korea, Japan. They are now dealing with what would be considered a second wave, which is primarily from people who are traveling, who are coming into the countries from outside, basically returning home. So their focus has been more on sort of watching their borders. But if we have that same pattern, I think we'll sort of go through the worst of it in the next couple of weeks and then slowly begin to feel more at ease. I mean, the fact of the matter is this thing is still a very mild disease for the most people who get it. It is one that the recovery rate is still very high. In China, the recovery rate is 80%. The death rate's been about 3.4. So once we sort of get to a point of, if I get it, I'll survive. If I get it, there's treatment. And if I get it, it may not be a horribly serious disease, then we will begin to relax a little bit. But as long as it's still escalating and it's still killing more people on a daily basis, we will be depressed until that begins to reverse.
Right. All right, just a couple more here. Which industries do you feel are being hit the hardest? And assuming travel is one of those, will that take longer to rebound than others?
Yeah, travel is definitely hit hard, but it could be one that rebounds relatively quickly because it'll depend on how businesses and how the consumer reacts. I mean, one of the things that's going to be a factor is that if we get the recovery that we're expecting or hoping for, the May, early June, that means that we start to come back to life in the summer, which is travel season. And if you get consumers that want to go back to normal at a rapid rate, there's going to be more impetus for them to want to travel than maybe in past years. Just looking at past disasters, and they've not necessarily been certain to this, but Go back to 9/11. 9/11 was the closest we've come to something like this, that it was an event that was unexpected. It caused a great deal of consternation and shutdown for a period of time. But when people decided to come back, they came back aggressively, kind of like, wow, you know, I've really missed my life and I want to go back to my restaurant and I want to go to Disney World and I want to do all this stuff. There may be a real surge when it comes to travel returning. The areas that are most likely to be long-term affected will be those small businesses that just didn't have the resources to survive 2 months of shutdown. The airlines will come back, the hotels will come back, Disney World will come back. They've got the resources to survive it and people will return. The smaller venues are going to be the ones that are going to have to figure out a way to resurrect themselves.
Great. Well, I think in the interest of time, we will make that the last question, but we really appreciate you being here and giving us all this useful information. And we hope everybody will be registered for next week's update with Chris. And we look forward to seeing you all then. So thanks again.
Very good.
And
Thanks.
we'll see you guys next week.